known as the New Jersey Volunteers, quote unquote, led by Brigadier General Cortlandt Skinner. They were officially commissioned on September 4th in 1776, but the men that would form the 1st Battalion were already commissioned as a Loyalist unit at the beginning of July of 1776. Initially, there were supposed to be 5 battalions comprised of 10 companies each, but with the growing number of loyalism and support that was coming after the Americans retreated through New Jersey, eventually a 6th battalion was commissioned, but they never reached full capacity thanks to attrition, casualties, desertion, and sickness. As the war went on, more of the ranks became filled with rebel prisoners rather than true loyalists. Something that was also very common in this war, you had loyalists that were captured that enrolled in the militia or Continental Army to avoid jail time and things like that. So it was always in the back of their minds questioning whether someone was truly loyal. And we saw that through William Howe's quote earlier that, you know, people played both sides and a lot of times for their own benefit. Unlike the rebel militia, who enlisted for a specific duration, those enlisted in the New Jersey Volunteers enlisted for the entirety of the war. They were not beholden to a specific area or colony, as many of the rebel militia were. And this would result in adventures outside of the New Jersey colony that both met with laurels and disaster. So while Skinner was the head of the Corps, and through 1780, they were actually referred to as Skinner's Greens. He only actually led them on one incursion into Monmouth County on June 21st, 1781. Command of the individual battalions was relegated to the lieutenant colonel of each battalion, as well as any regular British military officers where they were stationed. If there was a regular British military officer or unit, wherever the New Jersey Volunteers or any provincial unit was, command automatically deferred to the regular British military officer. So that would create some tension in a little bit that I'll show you, but that was the nature of the British command structure, as well as the American command structure at the time. Each battalion was generally made up of recruits from a specific region or county in New Jersey, which when these battalions were eventually merged 2 times over the years, created some tension in terms of whose loyalty lied where with what officers. And this image right here is of a silver belt plate from Ensign Justice Earl from the 4th Battalion of the New Jersey Volunteers. So there were some other provincial units during the war that are more well-known or saw more heavy action, like Delancey's Brigade, the Queen's Rangers, or Bannister Tarleton's British Legion. But the sheer amount of engagements that the New Jersey Volunteers participated in or were attributed to through different reports is actually quite staggering. With New York City being the headquarters of the British military, that required a huge amount of food and supplies to keep it going. And as a result, the areas of northern and eastern New Jersey became a hotbed of activity on both sides for the entire duration of the war. Foraging parties and small raids were commonplace, something that the New Jersey Volunteers were particularly equipped to do. And as we talked about in a little bit, the war in New Jersey became more of a civil war than a traditional war. But this is not to say that the New Jersey Volunteers did not take place in some notable engagements. For example, the 2nd Battalion served in the Philadelphia campaign as part of the Royal Artillery. They and the West Jersey Volunteers were part of the 2nd Division of British forces that retreated to New York through New Jersey and were involved in the Battle of Monmouth. But it was the 2nd who saw heavy artillery action during this conflict. And out of the 4 artillery personnel who were killed on the British side, all 4 were New Jersey Volunteers. Men from the 3rd Battalion, which at that point was condensed, so they were originally from the 4th Battalion, and I'll talk about this again a little bit later, merged into the 3rd. They were part of Benedict Arnold's attack on New London and Connecticut in September of 1781. Their job was to move artillery up a hill, but by the time they got there, the engagement had already ended. So I'm going to go into more detail about some of these engagements along with some other ones a little bit later on in the program. So, and here you can see, this is a map that I've created documenting all the engagements that the New Jersey Volunteers were part of or attributed to. And I've made different points here in different colors. So there's red ones where it's indicated that the New Jersey Volunteers were victorious in some capacity, or other New Jersey Loyalist units. The blue were uh, rebel partisans were victorious. Purple, there was really no clear decisive winner there. And then there is a little black mark up here that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. I'm sorry, the little black mark here is from May 30th, 1780, where 300 of the of the 4th Battalion mistook each other for Americans and fired upon themselves at Juice Zabrisky's house. There was about 7 or 8 killed, a number of other wounded. And if you want to look more into this, the Zabriskie family is very emblematic of New Jersey because they were a family divided. And so the part of the family supported the rebels, part of the family supported the British Crown, and they lived in the same town, and they were constantly at odds with each other. So it's interesting that at this place, which is so emblematic again of how the war was fought in New Jersey, that the New Jersey Volunteers fired upon each other. So as I mentioned before, most of the action surrounded here around Staten Island. You can see the high collection of markers there. And this was Bergen, Essex, and Monmouth County. There was high concentrations of Elizabethtown, Shrewsbury, and English neighborhood. Partisan forces moved in and out of these areas throughout the war, stripping them of food, supplies, natural resources, as well as prisoners. As more and more loyalists fled and their properties were confiscated, loyalist incursions became more violent and vindictive, including the burning of whole towns in vengeance. This is not to say that rebel forces treated non-combat loyalists with the utmost grace. This is merely to illustrate the gritty and sometimes savage nature of war that is truly the essence of the war in New Jersey as compared to other colonies. So. For this next session here, I'm going to talk about the 6 of the battalions and just do a little brief overview of each of them so you can get a sense of how each one kind of had its own identity. And throughout the war, they rarely acted as a whole. So the New Jersey Volunteers did not act as one complete unit. They were divided into companies, and usually each company or a collection of companies would go out and do things on their own. So it's a little bit different than how some of the other provincial units were active throughout the war. In traditional British military structure, each battalion would generally have a light infantry unit that was much more mobile and made up of the best marksmen in the unit. And they would often be selected for more important operations, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. But for the 1st Battalion here, it was originally formed under Colonel Elisha Lawrence, not the rebel Elisha Lawrence, who has more notoriety, and they often get confused in terms of people who are doing research. I've dealt with a couple people looking to prove loyalist intent when it's actually the rebel Elisha Alliance that they're actually researching. So, but this was from one of the first commissioned ones, and it was here in Monmouth County. And this was 40 to 60 men sailed over to Staten Island. They said, we want to join. And so Elisha Lawrence got a commission in order to raise the battalion. However, that would change when Lieutenant Joseph Barton would eventually take over. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit about that. Eventually both of these were captured. Joseph Barton was released earlier, so he got control of the unit, where Elisha Lawrence would have to settle and retire on half pay, long before he felt his service was rendered to the Crown. An interesting story regarding this is that one of the officers in the first occurred in January of 1780. Ensign John Lawrence became enraged at an officer of the Queen's Rangers for allegedly making disparaging remarks about the New Jersey Volunteers. After a brief barroom-style brawl, the matter was resolved the next evening with pistols in a duel. John Lawrence was slightly wounded by the Queen's Rangers officer, who unluckily was shot dead. A preceding court-martial cleared Lawrence of any and all charges. The 1st Battalion would cease to exist on October 10th in 1783, which was the official date of their disbandment, and they served over 7 years in defense of the Crown. And here you can see a list of the officers that this was taken from Rivington's Army's list of 1778 and thought to be from early summer of 1778. So you can kind of see the structure of how this unit was organized. Each one of these captains here, they would have their own company. This would change constantly through the war, who was part of which company, and they were constantly being interchanged as needed, depending on the strength of numbers and things like that. So just to give you an idea of some of the names of these patriots. All right, the 2nd New Jersey Volunteers was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Morris. He was originally a lieutenant in the 47th Regiment of Foot, but he refused to serve under Lawrence and instead received his own commission to recruit from Monmouth County. His efforts, as well as Lawrence's recruitment efforts, reached Washington's ears, and he immediately sent a regiment of Pennsylvania troops under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gurney to deal with them. On January 2nd of 1777, near Monmouth Courthouse, Lieutenant Colonel Morris received word of their arrival and attempted to pull his troops out of Middletown. However, the rebel troops pushed forward and just before dark engaged with Morris's recruits. After about 8 minutes, the Loyalists retreated, suffering 4 dead and 46 captured. As I mentioned, in the spring of 1777, Howe was preparing for his Philadelphia campaign, but the Royal Artillery was in desperate need of about 300 recruits. So instead of waiting for replacements from England or the commissioning of a new provincial unit, Howe assigned the 2nd Battalion to the Royal Artillery. They would serve there until November of 1779, and they would lose roughly half of their strength during that time. Upon returning to New York, they were doled out in groups of about 5 or 6 men to a variety of posts and other units, while the officers were forced to serve on various court-martials. In June of 1780, a detachment joined the Black Brigade under Colonel Tye and was able to capture New Jersey militia captain Joshua Huddy. Unfortunately, Huddy would escape during the retreat while his boat capsized, but it would be another 2 years before Huddy was captured again, but this time he would meet his demise and be publicly hanged. In the summer of 1781, the 2nd Battalion ceased to exist and was folded into both the 4th and the 1st Battalions. And here you can see again some of the officers that were part of this battalion. All right. So in November of 1776, Loyalist William Luce was authorized to raise a battalion from Essex County, but he was captured by the rebels soon after. As a result, command was then given to a prominent young man by the name of Edward von Doggen. Lieutenant Colonel Doggen was shot and mortally wounded defending a raid on Staten Island in 1777, which I'm going to be talking about later, dying just 3 hours before his 3-year-old son was killed in that same engagement. His wife and son fled from their quarters on Staten Island, and they were killed in the woods. Upon the first reorganization of the volunteers, command of the new 3rd was given to Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Allen, formerly commander of the 6th Battalion. Historian Todd Braystead notes, quote, that Allen was no doubt the finest commander among the different battalions of the New Jersey Volunteers. For the rest of the war, the unit would maintain an excellent record of discipline, and it had by far the fewest number of desertions and was involved in more large-scale actions than any of the other battalions. The 3rd Battalion and along with the 4th Battalion were responsible for a majority of the raids from Staten Island. As a result of their continued harassment in both Bergen and Essex counties, Continental General John Sullivan plotted his revenge, an act that would have disastrous consequences for the volunteers, which they would never fully recover from. However, they would be augmented by the West Jersey Volunteers in the fall of 1778 after they moved through New Jersey in their retreat. The 3rd Battalion also made up a majority of the provincial troops involved in the legendary raid of Little Egg Harbor, which I'll highlight on a little bit later. Out of all the New Jersey volunteer battalions, the 3rd saw the most action outside of the colony. Twice, multiple companies, including the light infantry, were sent to the southern colonies. The first occurred during the 78-79 campaign under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, while the second was a much longer stint under General Henry Clinton and then General Cornwallis. However, this would spell the end for many of the volunteers of the 3rd Battalion. The battalion received a land grant in Kings County, New Brunswick, where many of them would then take up their civilian lives. And here you can see some of those officers. All right. The 4th Battalion was commanded by a somewhat famous loyalist, Abraham Van Buskirk. It was reportedly raised in secret while New Jersey was still under the control of the rebels, and it was made up of a variety of people from different both social and economic classes. They were responsible for dozens of raids into Bergen and Essex counties, eliciting a response from Continental General John Sullivan, as I just mentioned before. In retaliation for General Sullivan's raid, British General Henry Clinton led a force of 1,500 British troops, including 300 New Jersey volunteers, mostly from the 4th Battalion, into Bergen County at 3 different landing points. Van Buskirk landed with some of the 4th at Elizabethtown, while the remainder of the battalion landed upriver near Tapan and marched southward. They were even awarded a citation for the Battle of Second River in Bellevue, where, according to General Clinton, quote, "I ordered Buskirk's battalion to march through a cornfield with the intention of taking in flank a body of rebels posted behind a stone wall, and which it would have been difficult to remove by a frontal attack. They marched," he added, "with such spirit that the Americans quit their positions without a shot." Now, while disease was always a concern during the war, especially this being in the 18th century, the 4th Battalion suffered from a bout of smallpox in February and March of 1778, which significantly reduced their number and forced General Clinton to consolidate the number of companies in the 4th from 10 companies to 5 in April of 78. The 4th certainly embodied the spirit of revenge as the war dragged on. On January 15th in 1780, Rebel Major General William Alexander, also known as Lord Sterling, led an early morning raid on Staten Island, crossing the kills between New Jersey and Staten Island in sleighs. It was so cold that about a third of his troops became inactive just due to frostbite. Having divided his forces upon landing, he soon realized that his plan was discovered and the New Jersey volunteers had entrenched themselves behind hardy defenses. His troops spent the whole day and a portion of the next stuck in the snow and bitter cold before retreating with only a few prisoners when British reinforcements arrived from New York. In an act of revenge, Van Buskirk led a counter raid on January 25th, landing in Elizabethtown. They were able to capture about 50 men without any casualties and with only a handful of shots fired. However, that wasn't enough to satisfy their revenge. Van Buskirk wrote to General Clinton the following day, quote, "It was impossible to prevent the refugees from burning the Presbyterian meeting house and the courthouse, against both of which the refugees had particular resentment. Otherwise, very little injury was done to the inhabitants." So the battalion then would muster for the last time on October 10th in 1783 when they received their official discharge. And here you can see officers from the 4th. The 5th was originally led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Barton, who would have a very active career in the volunteers. But before that, when he took over the 1st Battalion, he was content with leading a few raids, commanding the 5th, especially around Paramus and English neighborhood, before being assigned to garrison duty on Staten Island. Some notables of the 5th include Major Thomas Millage, one of the chief surveyors for New Jersey, and Ensign John Moody, whom I will go into more detail a little bit later in the program. And I always like to say he could have had a Netflix special with all the shenanigans that he claimed to have gotten into. So if any of you have not read his biography, please do so. It is filled with fascinating tales, some of which I don't know of how true they are, but the 5th Battalion did not last very long, though. They lost about 30 men after the Staten Island raid, including Joseph Barton. The unit fell into chaos after that as 3 officers, including 2 that were supposed to succeed Barton, left the unit and returned home. More disaster was on the horizon when James Moody tried to bring 100 men back from a recruiting mission in Sussex County, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania across the river. They were constantly harassed by the New Jersey militia. They were attacked in force near Perth Amboy, with over 60 of them taken prisoner, and half of them were sentenced to death. However, 2 were only actually executed, while the rest were given the chance to join the rebel militia, which most of them did. The 6th Battalion had the lowest rate of non-battle casualties and the highest rate of uniformity and functioning weapons in its brief tenure. Formed under Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Allen, their efforts were hurt significantly by Washington's attack on Trenton and Princeton by taking away their recruiting area, as well as capturing 2 of their warrant captains, Peter Campbell and Charles Harrison. Another setback occurred about 2 months later at Bennett's Island, which is currently in East Brunswick Township, where Major Richard Stockton of the 6th was conducting raids with members of the 1st, 2nd, and 5th Battalions. On February 18th, a former Continental soldier deserted from Stockton's unit and informed the militia colonel, John Nielsen, of Stockton's position. Seizing the moment, Colonel Nielsen led about 200 militia on a night raid to capture the New Jersey Volunteers. And without much of a fight, the militia were able to capture both Stockton and over 600 volunteers. The 6th did join General Clinton's foray into Bergen County in September of 1778, along with the 4th, but they were soon after folded into the 3rd Battalion. And there you can see how short that list is compared to some of the others. All right. So how many did serve in the New Jersey Volunteers? Well, this is historian Paul Smith's attempt to compile all of that information. So this comes out to, if you add these numbers here, to just under 2,500 in total throughout the duration of the war. And you can see here, these lines here are because these units would eventually merge into this. So some of this calculation here is being added up over in here. So again, this study was done about 60 years ago. So while things have changed and probably there are some more records available, there has really been no concerted effort on anybody's part to really nail this down. And I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation, how that might change, hopefully. So I just want to go over briefly some of the other Loyalist units that were in New Jersey. We have the West Jersey Volunteers. They were formed in Philadelphia by farmer and tavern keeper Richard Crayford after the successful British takeover. They were augmented by a company of men recruited by Captain Daniel Cozzens from Gloucester. During their tenure, they were maybe stationed at Billingsport, which is across the river from the Philadelphia International Airport. They made a few raids in the Gloucester County. And they traveled with the 2nd Battalion of the New Jersey Volunteers, performing guard duty for baggage and wagon supplies. Once they reached New York, some of them were folded into the 3rd Battalion, some of them were folded into Bannister Tarleton's British Legion, but a lot of them also deserted along the way. The origin of the Black Brigade is somewhat of a mystery, but references to its start appearing in mid-1779, along with its leader, Colonel Tye. It was mostly made up of African Americans, and many of them are freed slaves. And it was headquartered out of Refugee Town, which was a Loyalist settlement at the entrance to Sandy Hook that was founded by former slaves and fleeing Loyalists. It was one of several Black majority provincial units in the war, alongside the Black Pioneers and the Ethiopian Regiment. They were active for about a year, constantly raiding here in Monmouth County, targeting rebel slave owners in particular. Due to their effectiveness and ability to stoke fear in the minds of the rebels, they were eventually paired with the Queen's Rangers under the command of Captain John Graves Simcoe and continued raiding until the death of Colonel Tye in September of 1780. The Black Brigade would be folded into the Black Pioneers, which was commanded by Colonel Stephen Buck. The Loyal Refugee Volunteers was formed in early 1780 under Captain Thomas Ward, and it comprised mostly of Loyalists of Bergen County. Their main responsibility was to provide wood from the forests of Bergen County for the British Army in New York City. They did take place in some raiding, including an incursion into Newark on November 21st, 1780. They were also responsible for defending a blockhouse at Bowles Ferry in West New York from 1,000 Continentals under Brigadier General Mad Anthony Wayne, which will come into play a little bit when I do a little expose on James Moody. The King's Militia Volunteers were brainchild of former Royal Governor of New Jersey, William Franklin. Their initial purpose was to be a group of influential New Jersey loyalists who would be able to recruit loyalists for the British cause, and hoping to also obtain military rank and the pay that went with that. But they were only very briefly in existence, and they really had no impact on the war at all. And then the Monmouth County Militia was not an official loyalist unit, but it was still under the command of Brigadier General Cortlandt Skinner. Former rebel militia, Monmouth Militia Colonel George Tyler defected to the British on November 28th of 1776 and was authorized by Skinner to form a company of loyalists on December 18th. However, they were never incorporated into the volunteers. They raided Monmouth County throughout the spring and early summer of 1777, but were often met with stiff resistance. And it wasn't long after that that Colonel Taylor took a less active role in military operations out of Sandy Hook, and he was eventually captured on August 1st of 1780 with counterfeit continental currency as he and a handful of other refugees attempted to secure provisions clandestinely in Monmouth County. So I've been talking a lot about the New Jersey Volunteers. I want to go back and kind of set the stage for why did this happen? Why were so many people willing to serve for a duration of the war and fight or in service of the British Crown when so many of their other counterparts were willing to die for essentially freedom in their minds? While there was a lot of sentiment against the British Crown's imposition of multiple taxes, the issue of open rebellion against and separation from the British government was hotly contested here in New Jersey. This was evident in the proceedings of the Provincial Congress, which was initially formed on May 23rd, 1775, in response to the British military buildup in the New England colonies. This served as an antithesis to the already elected New Jersey Assembly and was made up of many representatives with a desire to declare open rebellion. Royal Governor William Franklin attempted to curtail the Provincial Congress's growing power in June of 1775, but was unsuccessful. While there was a few staunch loyalists elected to the Provincial Congress, they were unable to hold back the growing sentiment of war, which made them early targets for rebel partisans and reprisals. The Provincial Congress and local committees of correspondence and safety were already hard at work identifying and even arresting those whose sympathies were overtly British. In preparation for the British invasion of New York and inevitably New Jersey, the Provincial Congress started its series of ever harsher enactments against the Loyalists, which would push many into British service who would rather have stayed out of the conflict. The first of these measures occurred on August 2nd, 1776, which focused on appraising Loyalist properties that were either abandoned or left in the care of the family of known Loyalists who actively joined the British. Further action was taken just a couple months later, where even speaking out in support of the British was now punishable by fine or imprisonment. As the campaign stagnated in New Jersey, the actions of the Provincial Congress against the Loyalists became even more intense, leading to some of the harshest penalties in the colonies directed toward Loyalist sentiment. As you can see, more and more effort was directed toward punishing the Loyalists by confiscating their estates and property and making it nearly impossible for even suspected Loyalists to receive any form of fairness in any attempted defense that they may have. I'll give you a moment to read this. But it was actually quite fascinating uncovering this. So. So here's some more legal actions as they progressed. And the picture down here was taken from a New York newspaper regarding the sale of confiscated Loyalist lands in 1783. Notable New Jersey Loyalists whose land appears in this announcement include Daniel Cox, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Barton, and John Tempe. So, and a unique thing here that between December 1778 and June of 1781, New Jersey received almost 1.4 million pounds worth in continental currency of lands and goods confiscated from Loyalists. Yet due to currency depreciation, that value was only about 2% of the original value. And they actually passed laws to prevent the sale of this in order to wait for the currency to go back up before anything was sold. One of the things that I did find that is not in this presentation, in a 1781 almanac, there is actually an account of this depreciation where you have a sum of 4,000 continental dollars and then how much interest you would get for that loan. And you can see that it actually goes down about 96%. It loses about 96% of its value from 1777 to September of 1777 to March of 1780. So it's actually fascinating to see this principle here actually reported in an almanac in that fashion. So how are we doing on time? 7:45. Okay. I am actually going to go really quickly through this because I want to talk about the battles and what the New Jersey Loyalists actually were involved in. But this is just a little expose on Cortlandt Skinner, probably one of the most famous of the New Jersey Loyalists that we had here. He was Attorney General of New Jersey at the age of 25, and that was a post that he held until he fled to the British in 1776. He was elected to the Speaker of the Assembly twice. And so once he was tasked with raising a provincial corps by the British High Command. And once he did that, he kind of settled down in Staten Island and became the leading civilian and military authority on the island, which is why he never really actively participated in any of the engagements of the provincial unit that he raised. So I mentioned a little bit about Colonel Ty before. His real name was Cornelius Titus, and he was a runaway slave that joined the British Army. After the outbreak of the war in New England, he left his Quaker master, John Corliss of Shrewsbury Township, around November 1st of 1775. But what happened to him next is a matter of speculation. He kind of disappears from the history books, but the legend is that he made his way down to Virginia because he heard that Lord Dunmore down there was establishing a Ethiopian regiment, and so he wanted to join that to fight against, the Americans and their still support of slavery at the time. When he came back kind of into the historical record was in 1778. He was at first he's associated with leading a band of refugees, and then in 1779 he forms his own unit called the Black Brigade, and it was about 25 other former slaves. And then in early September of 1780, he led the Black Brigade and members of the 2nd New Jersey Volunteers as they attacked and captured Joshua Huddy at his home near Colts Neck. But during that, he would take a bullet to the wrist and die 2 days later of gangrene. So a little bit about Abraham Van Buskirk. He was born in Bergen County around 1735. He would become a doctor, a surgeon, an apothecary, marrying twice and siring 8 children. He lived in Teaneck and farm in Paramus. And remember that little black marker that I talked about where the 4th fired upon each other at Just Zabrisky's house? That was actually just across Newbridge from where he lived. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the 4th Volunteers decided to go and pursue that. So now James Moody. He's probably perhaps the most interesting character. He was living in Knowlton Township in Sussex County during the war, and he was content to be left alone with his family and farm. While he did harbor sentiment for the British in the same vein as Van Buskirk, he was not outspoken, nor did he participate in any public service. He did refuse to swear an oath against the crown, which resulted in the local militia trying to arrest him on March 28th in 1777. He was able to escape that and made his way to Staten Island along with about 75 other loyalists, where then he enlisted in Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Barton's 5th. His experiences during the war were extensive. He would lead raids, such as the one on June 10th, 1779, where he spearheaded a bayonet charge to cover his retreat. He led recruiting efforts in Pennsylvania and northwestern New Jersey. And he also participated in clandestine missions, such as trying to capture New Jersey Governor William Livingston Apparently, he hid in the forest for a week, hoping to capture Livingston on his return home, but that never happened. On one such occasion of trying to free prisoners, he successfully freed about 10 loyalists from the Newtown prison. I'm sorry, Newton prison. However, he was constantly pursued by rebel forces as he made his way back toward Elizabethtown. Eventually, he would be captured by Mad Anthony Wayne after his failed attempt to unseat the loyal refugee volunteers from Bowles Ferry in West New York. He was moved to a few different prison camps while he was captured, but apparently on September 17, 1780, he was able to secretly break out of his shackles and overpower the sentry. And upon raising the alarm surrounding his escape, he was able to blend in with the rebels, actively searching the camp for him. He was eventually able to sneak past the outer sentries and make his way back to Staten Island. And for the rest of the war, he was charged with spying and intercepting rebel intelligence. Eventually, he retired to London, where he penned his autobiography, Narratives of the Exertions and Sufferings of Lieutenant James Moody in the Cause of Government since the year 1776. So if you want some more, I encourage you all to read that book. Here's just some actions that the New Jersey Volunteers took place in around Middletown here. There is only one kind of documented case occurring kind of in the center of Middletown, and that's what I mentioned before about, I believe it was the second where some of them were captured in Middletown as they were trying to retreat from their recruiting efforts. But this all happened along and around Middletown and this area of Monmouth County. Again, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to go on to the next one again. Here's some more. So you can see really in 1778, 1779, 1780, when the war was really, really intensified in New Jersey in terms of these small conflicts, these skirmishes, these raids, things were happening all of the time, and especially around Staten Island and Bergen, Essex, and Monmouth counties. And then about this time here, you have the British regular units stationed in Sandy Hook. For a while, the New Jersey Volunteers were stationed in Sandy Hook Lighthouse and commanded there, which afforded them the opportunity to do a lot of these raids. Eventually, the New Jersey Volunteers would move out. There would be a British regular officer who was stationed there, and that was more just to secure the shipping lanes that were coming from England and from some of the southern Caribbean colonies. And so it became more of a base of operations to deal with naval issues rather than trying to launch raids into Monmouth County. So I really, really, really want to focus on this because this is probably the most important out of maybe Battle of Kings Mountain in the southern counties that the New Jersey Volunteers participated in. And this was the Staten Island raid of August 22nd, 1777. Upon William Howe's departure from New York City to Philadelphia, Major General John Sullivan saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the British stationed on Staten Island. After the fall of Long Island and New York City, Staten Island became the main staging ground for the British and their loyalist allies. With Howe's army gone, Sullivan believed that the island would be lightly defended, as well as unable to secure reinforcements in a timely manner. He communicated his plans to General Washington, but was told to stand down and bring his forces to support Washington's planned assault on Philadelphia. At that time, the British forces on Staten Island were commanded by Brigadier General John Campbell and consisted of the 52nd Regiment of Foot, Hessians from the German states of Waldeck and Ansbach, and a majority of the New Jersey Volunteers. They were stationed at posts along the northern and western edges of the shores of the island from Dexter's Ferry to Ward's Point, while the rest of the British regulars and Hessians were stationed at the garrison stronghold of Watering Place. So this is where the New Jersey Volunteers were, and then this is where the rest of the British forces were stationed. General Sullivan embarked with men from the 1st and 2nd Maryland Brigades, the 2nd Canadian Regiment, and a company of New Jersey militia numbering about 1,000 men. He split his forces into 2 divisions under the commands of Brigadier General William Smallwood and French officer Chevalier Philippe Hubert Prudhomme de Boer. A small detachment from Sullivan's main force, led by Colonel Matthias Ogden, crossed at Fresh Kills and surprised Lieutenant Colonel Elisha Lawrence's 1st New Jersey Volunteers, forcing a full-scale retreat while capturing 80 of them, including Lawrence. Ogden then pushed on to the outpost of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Doggin's 3rd Volunteers. The rebels encountered very stiff resistance, and even though Dongan was mortally wounded, they were forced to retreat and ultimately crossed the Kills back into New Jersey. In the meantime, Sullivan and de Boer landed at New Blazing Star and immediately set upon Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Barton and his 5th New Jersey Volunteers. Seeing they were vastly outnumbered, Barton ordered a retreat, but Sullivan sent some of his men to cut off the retreat and captured Barton and 40 additional men. Some of Sullivan's men attempted to march on Cortlandt Skinner's headquarters, but it was too heavily guarded, and they quit to the town of Richmond to wait for Smallwood's force. And Smallwood landed at Decker's Ferry with the hopes of ambushing Lieutenant Colonel Abraham Van Buskirk's 4th in the rear, but was misguided and set upon their main force. The 4th retreated until reinforcements from Skinner's garrison arrived, and they drove Smallwood's force back to Richmond. Upon learning of the invasion, Campbell dispatched his men and joined the remnants of Skinner's volunteers, driving Sullivan's forces to the coast where there were not enough boats to ferry all of the rebels back across. The rear guard of 80 men that Sullivan left to cover the crossing surrendered shortly after the rebels made their escape. While the incursion into Staten Island was a complete failure for Sullivan, he did manage to inflict enough damage on the New Jersey Volunteers to weaken their overall strength, forcing Skinner to reorganize the 6 battalions into 4. And here is a muster roll of Lieutenant Colonel Elisha Lawrence's companies from March of 1778. And you can see here, these are all the prisoners that were taken at the Battle of Staten Island. That was over half of his company that was taken. So, and there are a lot of other muster rolls that have the same type of designation where a lot of the unit was captured on August 22nd of 1777. Just quickly on the Little Egg Harbor raid. This was in response to 2 British prize ships that were attacked and captured by rebel privateers. And to stop this, Clinton would send Cornwallis and General Kniphausen up the Hudson River as a diversion, and would send a small force under Captain Patrick Ferguson to raid Little Egg Harbor. This force consisted of 400 men, 300 from the 5th Regiment of Foot, as well as 100 New Jersey volunteers from the 1st and 3rd battalions. Washington sent General Count Kazimierz Pulaski to intercept this area on October 6th of 1778. They were unable to enter Little Egg Harbor, so Ferguson decided to drop rowboats and row about 10 miles before making his advance toward Chestnut Neck up Malukas Creek. The small detachment of the militia there scattered upon a charge from Ferguson's men, giving them full reign of the town. They destroyed roughly 15 ships of various sizes. They burned all of the buildings in the town, including 12 houses, several barns, and storehouses. The main depot of the supplies that were taken off these ships was about 20 miles up the creek, but Ferguson determined that it was too difficult to get there. However, Pulaski's force would arrive just too late to catch Ferguson's troops. However, bad weather delayed Ferguson from getting back to the British ships and sailing back to New York City. Learning that where Pulaski's legion was stationed because of a deserter from his legion, informed Ferguson of Pulaski's exact location and forces. So Ferguson decided to strike at Pulaski's legion early on the morning of October 15th. So he led 250 men to Osborne Island and attacked Pulaski's picket post at the unattended home of Jeremiah Ridgway, which was roughly about a mile from Pulaski's camp. The British surrounded the roughly 50 men at the post, and only 5 were taken prisoner. the rest were massacred. And there actually is a monument there that shows that dedicates to that massacre. So this drawing was done by the infamous Brigadier or Adjutant General William Stryker and appears in the written version of the speech he gave at the dedication of a memorial tablet erected on the site of the massacre. So this is where they landed up here. They crossed this bridge. They slaughtered them there. And as the rest of Pulaski's Legion was coming down this island road here, Ferguson's men retreated, tore up the bridge here so that they could not pursue them any farther. The Battle of Connecticut Farms and also the Battle of Springfield were two other notable engagements that the New Jersey Volunteers were part of. I am going to skip this part. It's very technical in terms of troop movements and everything, but it was an attempt by General Knyphausen while Clinton was in the southern colonies conquering Charleston and then turning command over to Cornwallis down there, where Knyphausen decided that he was going to try and attack Washington's army in Morristown because he heard that morale was low, that they were dealing with sickness, and they only numbered about 3,500 men. He would push about 6,000 troops over the Kills into New Jersey in two divisions and try to attack, but the rebel Continentals as well as the militia were able to eventually hold them off. So then a few weeks later, on the 23rd, they would try the same tactic again. This time General Clinton had come back. Knyphausen convinced him to try this attack again. And then, as you can see here, this is what happened. I'll give you a minute to look at that. The New Jersey Volunteers were actually going back and forth between the two divisions as they were ordered. When one would be stalled, they would send the New Jersey Volunteers to try and break that stalemate. So this is probably one of the most ferocious engagements that some of the New Jersey Volunteers fought in, the exception being the Battle of Kings Mountain, which I'm going to end in just a little bit. All right, and here you can see the two roads that they were taking from Elizabethtown. Here's Connecticut Farms, and both times they were able to push from Connecticut Farms to Springfield, but with these mountains and hills here, the rebels were able to defend that area and prevent the British from entering the Watchung Mountains. So in the Southern campaign here, as I mentioned, there was two stints where the New Jersey Volunteers participated. The first was the 1778-1779 campaign, where they took Savannah on December 29th in 1778 with very, very few losses. After that, a combination of French and American forces tried to retake Savannah in September of 1779, but they were repulsed. And the New Jersey Volunteers were stationed at this redoubt right in the front. So while you have your artillery and your officers and your other British regulars who are going to be down in this area, they put the provincials, the expendables essentially, out in front to take the frontal assaults. And they were able to survive the siege. Eventually, a British fleet would come into the area, which would force the Americans and French to retreat. Because if they were caught by the British fleet, then they would be decimated. They would have no way to get back to the naval units that they used to launch this assault. All right. While the 3rd Battalion was with the New Jersey Volunteers, was stationed with Archibald Campbell in Savannah, the rest of the 3rd Battalion sailed south with General Clinton's main force in the spring of 1780 with the intent of capturing Charleston and securing the southern colonies. Despite their presence, the New Jersey Volunteers were not actively used in the siege of Charleston, but upon its fall, they were sent to Augusta, Georgia for a brief stint before moving to the garrison at 96 under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Allen. On August 19th, 1780, a group of Loyalists, including members of the Light Company of the 3rd Battalion, were on their way to join Captain Patrick Ferguson. The same Patrick Ferguson who led the raid on Little Egg Harbor was now part of the Southern campaign and was actually forming his own provincial unit called the American Volunteers. And part of this was that the New Jersey volunteers who volunteered for service were being kind of forced into this new provincial unit that was created. Learning that a small detachment of rebel militia, about 200 men, were pursuing them, the Loyalists under Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Innes determined to engage and disperse them. Failing for a feigned retreat by some of the militia, Innes led the Loyalists directly into the rebel militia's fortified positions. Firing too early to inflict any casualties, the Loyalists were met with a barrage of bullets that found their mark. Even in the face of heavy casualties, the Loyalists were able to charge the right flank with bayonets and nearly overwhelm that section of the rebel militia. However, a reserve troop of what they called the Over Mountain Men in the Carolinas forced the Loyalists to retreat. All of the officers of the 3rd Battalion's light infantry were wounded, and most of the troops were either killed or wounded. And this area down here is where the New Jersey volunteers were, and you can see that they were pushed back here to Spring Hill or Utah Springs. All right. Now, in addition to the 3rd Battalion, about 100 men of the other 3 New Jersey volunteer battalions at that time also joined General Clinton's army in the South. These men were attached, as I said, to Captain Patrick Ferguson's newly formed provincial unit, the American Volunteers. Made up of Loyalists of a variety of colonies, this unit would be responsible for rousing Loyalists in the Carolina interior while harassing the roving bands of rebel militia and partisan forces. Things did not start or end well for the American Volunteers, especially those from the New Jersey Volunteers. Landing in Georgia, the New Jersey Volunteer commanding officer was Lieutenant Martin Ryerson, and he died almost immediately from malaria in February of 1780. Then on their way north to support the preparations for the siege of Charleston, they were mistaken as rebel militia by Major Cochrane of the British Legion. On March 14th, Cochrane engaged the American Volunteers picket, and a brief skirmish ensued where 2 men from the Volunteers and 1 from the Legion were killed. Several others were wounded, including Captain Ferguson, who took a bayonet to the arm. Exactly a month later, during the siege of Charleston, the American Volunteers were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton of the British Legion. And while General Clinton dispatched Tarleton to deal with the rebel General Isaac Huger, who was tasked with protecting the rebel supply lines to Charleston, Tarleton decided to attack him at Monk's Corner around 3 a.m. on April 14th. And this was one of the brief successes where they were able to completely rout the militia. All right. And this is just a listing of all of the New Jersey Volunteers who joined Patrick Ferguson's American Volunteers. So you can see that they were from the 1st Battalion, they were from the 2nd Battalion, and the 4th Battalion. Again, the 3rd Battalion was in Savannah and some other areas. This was made up from the other 3 battalions at the time. And there was a lot of them. And again, unlike rebel militia who generally stayed within their area of where they were recruited, the New Jersey Volunteers, again, were tasked with fighting in a variety of settings. And I want to end with Kings Mountain, and I'm calling it the disaster at Kings Mountain. After the fall of Charleston, Ferguson was ordered to secure loyal support and raise new recruits from the South Carolina backcountry. After some brief skirmishes with rebel partisan forces and success in enlarging his ranks, a combined force of about 900 rebel militia began pursuing Ferguson, noting his isolation from British reinforcements from the posts at 96 and their central operations in Charleston. Ferguson sent out riders at the beginning of October to secure aid from the British posts, but no help would arrive in time. Recognizing his precarious position, he determined to make a stand on a small plateau called Kings Mountain, about 2 miles from the South Carolina-Georgia border. Entrenching his force of 1,100 men atop the hill, he waited for the inevitable, which would finally come on October 7th. Rebel militia leaders William Campbell, John Seaver, Joseph McDowell, William Hill, Edward Lacey, Benjamin Cleveland, Joseph Winston, William Chronicle, and Isaac Shelby surrounded the hilltop and with a zeal attacked from all sides. Even though the American Volunteers had the high ground, they consistently overshot their rebel targets, inflicting very few casualties, while the rebel bullets seemed to find their marks. The rebels then adopted a plan of retreating on one side while pushing from the opposite side, forcing Ferguson's men to move back and forth over the mountaintop expending most of their ammunition. Realizing the oncoming defeat, Ferguson attempted one final rally to push through the militia lines, but was shot multiple times atop his horse and died. Shortly afterward, the Loyalist force surrendered, including all of the men from the New Jersey Volunteers. So that was a lot. I want to thank you for my drolling on about the British sympathizers in New Jersey, but I really appreciate your time and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Many organizations did not fare well. One was decimated, one was almost destroyed, many took heavy casualties. Are there known factors for their lack of effectiveness, whether it was leadership, training, weaponry, or whatever?
I don't know if it was anything related to their training or leadership. It was actually one of the most effective, and if you saw in New Jersey, one of the most effective units. They were not designed for regular combat, and that was a misconception that the British High Command had, was that these loyalist and provincial units could function in the same role as the British military. And that was not how it worked. They did not have essentially the training. Their job was more, and what they should have been doing was more essentially peacekeeping, keeping things calm in the interior while the British forces were able to do what they wanted. However, and this is what I studied in my thesis, is that the British military, again, tried and tried again to utilize them in a typical fighting fashion, and they were not designed, at least in the southern colonies. For the New Jersey Volunteers, as you can see, they did the best they could. They were oftentimes put in very precarious positions. Again, you had a lot of issues in terms of retention in provincial units, just like you had them in rebel militia units, where they would serve for a period of time, things didn't go well, they wanted to leave. And you can see through the muster rolls of the New Jersey Volunteers, you can see constant changeover, where people were deserting and joining. It was just a fact of life then, but I don't think it had anything to do with their effectiveness or their ability, because you could see they if you look at the map that I had with all the dots, a majority of them were red, which means that they were essentially victorious in some way. So
best they could, got some of them decimated, destroyed, and taking heavy casualties.
yes, unfortunately, yes.
What percent of the loyalists after the war were able to go back to Britain, and would Britain accept them? And did they give any stipends? They went back to England.
Outside of maybe some of the most prominent figures in society at that point, so your wealthy gentry, some of those would have went back because they would have had at least some connections in Britain to go back to, whether they were sponsors or people they corresponded with. But a vast majority of the loyalists, particularly in New Jersey, left when the British left New York and made their way to Canada. They were given a lot of land grants there. And if you look at the records in Canada, it will say where people were given lands and what battalions and what units they served in. And you can find tons of records of New Jersey Volunteers being transported from New York City to Canada. Yes, yep. But once the war was done, they eventually all kind of moved and took what they could. Again, a lot of this had to do with the persecution of them over the years. They eventually just moved into the British lines around New York, and when it was evacuated, they were basically all shipped up to Canada because that was a place where they could start a new life. So, yes.
In the New Jersey Volunteers with the Board of Associated Loyalists under Franklin?
There were members who corresponded, like they knew of each other, at least the officers knew of each other, but really this was a military force that had nothing to do with kind of that civilian aspect of it. They were directly under military control, and their duties and their orders were all military. So they took their orders from British military figures, officers in the regular British Army mostly. Mm-hmm. I don't remember, it might have been the first or the second. I don't remember off the top of my head. Oh yeah. There were some, but a vast majority, again, as I said, your more learned men, probably your officers were going to be part of that, just given their status, and their ability to get away from military life. If you look at the muster records, it's interesting to see how many of the British office or the New Jersey volunteer officers were able to be absent on leave in a variety of places, where the rest of the privates were on guard duty, were stationed here, were participating here, were dead, were suffering and sick. It's very interesting if you look at that they were given all these chances to go on leave while they were in Staten Island. So that's what would give them an afforded opportunity to participate in that organization, in a sense. So. Mhm. Mhm.
What happened to these, like, when the men went off, with the patriots went off? What happened to the wives and the children?
Oftentimes they would stay behind. They would, yes. So what would happen, at least in terms of if you had loyalist men who fled to either support the British in New York City in some way or join the military, but would leave their wives and children behind to manage their estates or their property, eventually those estates and properties would be confiscated. And then that would force then the women and children then to move essentially to New York City to, to live within the British means that were there. And then they would then, if they survived, they all then moved up to Canada at that point. So really, even if there was a woman and a child in an area, as the war progressed, the rebels did not care. It was, you are a loyalist. This is your property. We are taking it. We are going to raise money. We're going to do whatever we can to show that we don't want you here. And so that's what happened with a lot of loyalists in there, that eventually their estates were just confiscated and any families that were there were forced to flee. So now they wouldn't murder the women and the children and all that they were there, but they would basically take everything and, here's a sack, get on your way. This is ours now. So.
The second battalion was involved in capturing Joshua. Where you said that, right?
Yes. Yeah. When
They turned over to association loyalists.
Well,
turned into murdering him down.
actually, no. The second battalion was part of the original capture of him. However, he escaped. The second time that he was captured was actually by a party of what they called refugees, captured him. So it wasn't the New Jersey Volunteers that did it. They captured him in response to the killing of a loyalist that happened, a couple days before that. So they found him, they captured him, and really without trial, they just publicly hanged him. So yes, yeah. Yes. Right. And eventually Washington did stay his hand. Yes. Well, yes. Yep. It is. Yes. Oh,
He's buried 10 feet away from the guy that killed him. King's
King's Highway.
Which is pretty fast. You talk about neighbor against.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
I was just wondering where refugee town might have been in Sandy Hook, which I often know it's changed a great deal.
Yeah. So Refugee Town would have been essentially where the peninsula starts. So what they did is kind of blockade that peninsula, the entrance there. They built barricades, they kind of fortified it and made their own little town at the start of the peninsula. So that nobody was able to then to kind of move on and go up to Sandy Hook. But that whole peninsula, especially where it touched the mainland, that's where they
indicates that Refugee Town was probably near where the mass school is now.
Okay.
Not far from the fort, which was near the lighthouse.
Right.
That's what I.
Yeah, it wasn't
rather
direct.
than-
Yeah. Yeah, there's there's debate about it, but
Thinking of how they killed each other with the guns they had, which took almost a minute and a half to load it, put a top in, and it wasn't an AK-45.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was not slow motion, but these guys, it was tough. They would, and the British especially, would line up 3 different columns, and one would shoot next one, It was, they were very static in that.
yes, they were very static in how they approached warfare.
So the New Jersey Volunteers who went south of them, did they, when that conflict ended, were they arranged, did they were given back to New Jersey, or did they go direct to Canada, most of them, or did they have to fend themselves and? Stay, or?
Some of them would relocate their lives down in South Carolina, North Carolina, down there. Some of them, with the eventual evacuation, they were exchanged in prisoner exchanges. And then when the South was evacuated, they came back up to New York City. But they didn't rejoin the ranks at that point. They essentially just waited, because by that time the war was almost over. And the writing was on the wall at that point, that there was no real need for their service. And you can see in the list of loyalists of the New Jersey Volunteers, really at the start of 1782, the activity kind of just dropped off, outside of a few reprisals that's, a few men would take because they wanted vengeance on something. They would do that, but there was really no concerted effort at that point to utilize them in any military fashion.
One more question.
Yeah. Sure.
So, were any Yorktown or no?
No. The New Jersey Volunteers, they were split between essentially guard duty at Savannah in 96. And then the other ones were part of the American volunteers that were killed and captured at Kings Mountain. The Cornwallis eventually, as he moved his way from South Carolina to North Carolina, became completely fed up with any loyalists at all, and said that they're not even worth my time or effort, essentially, to even bother with. And so my goal, and a lot of scholars attribute Cornwallis's moves to his arrogance or his lust for power for what he did, but he was determined to end the war by his fighting force against the other fighting force, and he was done with the Loyalists. He was done with British supporters, because, as I argued in my thesis, he is constantly presented with Loyalist and Loyalist units, and they fail him nonstop in what he was promised in terms of their numbers or their effectiveness. And he said that it's not even worth my time. They can't do what I need them to do to win this war. And so that's why he made the decisions he did to move to, yes, outside of the British Legion, which he had a very somewhat cordial relationship with Bannister Tarleton. But it was kind of like the disappointing son over and over again with him, as they went. But the British Legion, again, was made up of professional soldiers, where this was not. This was a provincial unit that was trained. They were effective, but they weren't professional soldiers, and they did not accompany on the way to Yorktown. So, yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody. I really, really appreciate it.